On the night of October 17th, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Adrienne Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and smoke a cigarette. It was very late, about 1:30 a.m. The cabin where she was staying was very isolated, about half a mile from the nearest neighbors, but Adrienne actually liked the quiet. She was surrounded by woods and swamps, and being in the wilderness made her feel safer than when she was in her full-time home in Detroit, which was a big, crowded city. This feeling of safety came after something terrible happened to her a few months earlier in Detroit. Adrienne had been attacked for no reason. She was out in the city, surrounded by people, when a man suddenly came up to her, hit her, broke her nose, and gave her a concussion before running away. He didn't steal anything, and he didn't know her. It seemed like he just picked her at random. The man was never caught. This attack had a big effect on Adrienne's health, both physically and mentally. She began to feel worse, and then she also lost her engineering job. She was unemployed and very depressed. So, when her uncle called and asked if she would stay in the 2-story family cabin to get it ready for winter, Adrienne quickly agreed. Not only would it help her with her job situation, but she also loved the cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and she had many happy childhood memories there. It seemed like the perfect place to escape the city, relax, and recover from the trauma of the attack. Adrienne and her boyfriend had been staying at the cabin for the past week, working on small repairs and cleaning it up. 2 days before, her boyfriend had left to go back to the city where they were fixing up a condo. Now it was just Adrienne and her dog, but that was okay with her. She liked being out there on her own. That night, Adrienne felt frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but it hadn't worked. Instead, she felt wide awake and anxious. Hoping that a walk might help clear her mind, she decided to take her dog outside. The roads around the cabin were small and winding, and there were no streetlights. It wasn't the best place to go for a walk at night, but Adrienne knew the area very well. For safety, she also had a 9mm pistol in her pocket. After walking for a few minutes, her dog stopped to relieve itself near a bush. While the dog was going to the bathroom, Adrienne smoked a cigarette and waited. Suddenly, her dog stopped, turned, and started growling. Its ears perked up as it looked into the darkness ahead. Adrienne's instincts kicked in, and she quickly grabbed her flashlight, pointing it in the direction her dog was looking. As soon as she turned on the light, it shone on 2 eyes staring right back at her. Adrienne immediately knew what it was, a mountain lion. Staying as calm as she could, Adrienne slowly reached into her pocket for her gun. But before she could pull it out, the mountain lion blinked and then quickly ran off into the forest. It was gone. After making sure it wasn't coming back, Adrienne sighed in relief. She pulled her dog's leash and hurried back to the cabin. When Adrienne reached the cabin, which was brightly lit because she had left all the lights on, she rushed up the steps, opened the door, and went inside with her dog. After letting the dog off its leash, she locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him what had just happened with the mountain lion. After sending the message, she felt safer inside the cabin, but still couldn't shake the feeling of being on edge. She had been just a few feet away from a mountain lion, all alone, in the middle of nowhere at night. As Adrienne tried to calm herself down, she heard a noise outside, near the living room window. It sounded like twigs snapping, as if someone was walking by the window. The cabin's layout meant that when you walked in, you entered the kitchen, and in the back was the living room. There were stairs that led up to the second floor. From the kitchen, Adrienne had a clear view into the living room, and she could see the window where the noise came from. From where Adrienne stood in the kitchen, she could see the living room window where the noise had come from. But because the inside of the cabin was brightly lit and the outside was pitch black, all she could see was her own reflection in the glass. To see anything outside, she would have to get closer. Feeling nervous, she slowly walked across the cabin, moving towards the window. Pressing her face against the cold glass, she stared into the darkness but saw nothing. Stepping back, Adrienne began to wonder if the noise she had heard was the mountain lion following her. The thought scared her, but at least she was inside the cabin now. She tried to reassure herself, thinking, mountain lions don't do that. They wouldn't follow someone like that. She brushed it off and did her best to calm down. Taking off her coat and putting her things down, she sat on the couch in the living room and turned on the TV to relax. About 20 minutes later, just as she was beginning to unwind and considering going to bed, another noise came from the same window. This time, when she looked up, her heart sank. She saw something moving outside. It wasn't a mountain lion. It looked like a man. Adrienne stifled a scream. Without thinking, she lunged for her gun on the coffee table, quickly crouching behind the couch to hide. She wanted to make sure whoever was outside couldn't see her. Clutching the gun tightly, she shouted, "Hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you." But there was no response. Adrienne held her breath, trying to listen for any sound that might reveal the person's location. All she could hear was the wind whipping outside and the distant hoot of an owl. The silence was chilling. But just as Adrienne started to wonder if she had imagined the figure, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the front porch. Her heart pounded in her chest as she forced herself to stay quiet. She quickly moved to the other side of the couch, gripping her phone in one hand and her gun in the other. Her fingers hovered over the call button, ready to dial 911, but she hesitated. Ever since the attack in Detroit, Adrienne had been on edge. Almost everything made her jumpy now. Maybe she was just being paranoid, imagining things that weren't really there. She didn't want to call the police in the middle of the night and have them come all the way out to her cabin for nothing. But what if there really was someone outside? She couldn't ignore the possibility. Instead of calling the police, Adrienne dialed her boyfriend. As the phone rang, she strained to hear any more sounds outside, but it was silent again. Her boyfriend didn't answer. It was late, after all, and it was now 2:30 a.m., but she couldn't wait. She dialed one of her friends, and thankfully, this time, someone answered. Right away, her friend could tell something was wrong. Adrienne, her voice shaky and trembling, explained everything, how she had seen the mountain lion, heard strange noises, and spotted the figure outside the window. She confessed how terrified she was. Her friend tried to calm her, but Adrienne could barely hold it together. The fear had built up inside her like a wave, ready to crash. "I'm so scared," she whispered, her voice cracking as tears filled her eyes. Her friend spoke firmly but kindly. "I'm going to call the police for you, okay? Just to make sure everything is all right. Give me the address and I'll send them to you." Adrienne hesitated, then finally gave her friend the address. "Just don't call yet," she pleaded. "Stay on the phone with me for a minute. Let me check again. Maybe it's nothing." Her friend reluctantly agreed to wait. With her gun in hand and the phone pressed to her ear, Adrienne crept from behind the couch, keeping low to the ground. She moved cautiously from the living room into the kitchen, staying out of sight of the windows. Step by step, she edged her way toward the sink, where there was a small window overlooking the front porch, the spot where she had last heard the footsteps. With a deep breath, Adrienne slowly raised her head just enough to peek through the window. The porch was empty. No one was there. Relief washed over her, and she let out a shaky breath. She laughed softly, the tension loosening as she half cried. "There's no one there," she told her friend, feeling a little foolish. It must have just been the wind or something. But just as she was about to reassure her friend and say they didn't need to call the police, Adrienne froze. Her eyes drifted back toward the living room, and what she saw made her heart drop. In the window where she had first heard the noise, there were now two dark silhouettes, men, standing right outside, staring into the cabin. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Instinctively, she raised her gun, aiming at the window. But to her horror, the two men raised their guns too, pointing them directly at her. Without thinking, Adrienne pulled the trigger. Gunshots echoed through the small cabin, deafening as the bullets shattered the glass. The men fired back, filling the air with the sound of gunfire and chaos. Adrienne dove behind the kitchen island, clutching her phone and gun. Her friend was still on the line, screaming, "What's happening? What's going on?" "I shot one of them," Adrienne cried, her voice trembling. "I think I hit one of them in the head." Suddenly, everything went silent. Adrienne held her breath, her ears ringing from the noise. There was no sound, no movement. For a moment, she wondered if she had killed both men. Maybe that's why it was quiet. Maybe it was over. But then, from above, she heard it, a loud, slow thumping sound coming from the second floor. Someone was upstairs. Panic flooded Adrienne's body as she realized there might be another attacker, one who had somehow gotten inside the cabin. Her instincts screamed at her to grab her dog and run, to escape into the forest while she had the chance. If the person was upstairs, the woods outside might be clear. She could get away, but something inside her snapped. Ever since the attack in Detroit, she had been running, always letting fear control her. Not this time. Not in her family's cabin, her safe place. This time, she wasn't going to run. With steely determination, Adrienne stood up. Her heart pounded, but she tightened her grip on the gun. Step by step, she made her way to the stairs, ready to confront whoever, or whatever, was up there. The police arrived at the cabin 30 minutes later, alerted by Adrienne's friend, who had called them during the shootout. They approached the cabin cautiously, weapons drawn, preparing for the confrontation with the gunman that Adrienne had described. Inside, they found the scene of a violent gunfight. Bullet holes riddled the walls, and broken glass from the shattered window was scattered across the floor. But there was no sign of Adrienne or the attackers. The cabin was eerily silent, disturbed only by the occasional creak of the wind in the trees. Adrienne's dog was discovered inside, frightened but unharmed. There were no bodies, no blood, no clear evidence of where Adrienne or the gunman had gone. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. A thorough search of the cabin and the surrounding forest yielded no answers. The only strange findings were Adrienne's shoes and her phone, discovered on the roof of the cabin. Her gun was also found on the ground near the cabin, as though she had climbed onto the roof at some point and then descended or jumped down. The police were baffled. They launched an extensive search of the area, but found no trace of Adrienne or the intruders. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no evidence that anyone had been injured. The only bullets recovered from the scene were those fired from Adrienne's gun, yet both inside and outside the cabin, the police found shell casings from multiple firearms, indicating that other guns had been fired as well. But the gunmen, along with Adrienne, were gone. Weeks passed with no new leads. The case grew cold, and rumors began to spread. Some people speculated that Adrienne had staged the entire event to disappear, while others believed she had been abducted, possibly by someone or something, on that fateful night. Theories ranged from alien abduction to a mental breakdown, but the truth remained out of reach. Then, on December 21st, 2019, 2 months after Adrienne's disappearance, her family, desperate for answers, decided to drain a pond located about 300 yards from the cabin. The pond had already been searched, but the family wanted to be thorough in their search for closure. As the water was drained, they made a horrific discovery. Adrienne's body was found submerged in just a foot of water. When police examined the scene, it became clear that Adrienne's body had been in the pond for quite some time. Initially, investigators believed she had been chased into the water, possibly shot by her attackers, and succumbed to her injuries there. But as they examined her body further, this theory quickly fell apart. There were no gunshot wounds, no bruises, no scrapes, nothing to indicate she had been in any sort of physical struggle before her death. This lack of injury puzzled the investigators. If she hadn't been attacked, what had caused her death? The autopsy provided answers, but also deepened the mystery. Toxicology reports revealed that Adrienne had ingested a mix of substances the night she died. She had taken Valium, a sedative, likely to calm her nerves and help her sleep. But the shocking discovery was that she had also been smoking methamphetamine, a powerful stimulant. This combination of drugs likely pushed Adrienne into a highly agitated, paranoid state. Investigators now believed that the strange events of that night, the mountain lion, the figures outside the window, and the gunfight, were all part of a drug-induced hallucination. The men she thought she had seen through the window were likely just her own reflection, distorted by her heightened fear and paranoia. As for the gunfire, police concluded that Adrienne had likely been shooting at her reflections, believing they were attackers. The mysterious figures she had been so terrified of never existed. The sounds she heard, like footsteps on the second floor, were likely just her heightened awareness while in a state of meth-induced panic. At some point that night, after believing she had shot or injured her attackers, Adrienne likely fled the cabin in a desperate attempt to escape. She climbed onto the roof, leaving behind her phone and shoes, before running barefoot into the forest. Disoriented and overwhelmed by fear, Adrienne eventually collapsed in the pond, where she died from a combination of hypothermia and the toxic effects of the drugs in her system. The truth was heartbreaking. Adrienne hadn't been attacked by intruders or chased by unknown figures. The real threat had come from within her own mind, twisted by the trauma of her earlier assault and worsened by the drugs she had taken to cope with her anxiety. The fear that had consumed her that night had ultimately led to her tragic end. Adrienne Quintal's story is a chilling reminder of how powerful our minds can be when distorted by fear and substances, and how sometimes the greatest dangers we face come from within.